To help put some more recent numbers in perspective, I wanted to describe the 2019-2020 legislative session by the numbers. In terms of the bills over that 2-year session, there was a total of 4,848, so 48 bills were introduced between the Senate and the Assembly in that 2-year session. In 2019, there were 2,625 bills introduced between the two houses. And in 2020, there were 2,223 bills introduced. In the Senate, there were a total of 1,474 SBs introduced in the 2 years, 682 SBs in 2020, 792 SBs in 2019. On the Assembly side, there were a total of 3,374 ABs introduced during the 2-year session, 1,541 ABs in the 2020 session, and 1,833 ABs in the 2019 session. In looking at the bills in greater detail, on the Senate side first, in 2019, 792 SBs were introduced. Of those, 562 SBs passed the Senate, and only one SB failed on the Senate floor. In 2020, 346 SBs made it to the governor's desk, and 2019, and 296 SBs were signed while 50 SBs were vetoed. So again, in 2019, 346 SBs made it to the governor's desk. In 2020, 682 SBs were introduced. 246 SBs passed the Senate. 2 SBs failed passage on the Senate floor. And 130 SBs made it to the governor's desk, and 117 of those were signed, with 20 SBs being vetoed. Remember, 2020 was the first year of the pandemic, so the number of bills were reduced by almost 3/4. On the Assembly side, for the 1920 legislative session, in 2019, 1,833 ABs were introduced. Of those, 1,040 passed the Assembly, and not a single AB failed passage on the floor. 696 ABs made it to the governor's desk in 2019. Of those, 574 ABs were signed, and 122 ABs were vetoed. In the 2020 session, 1,549 ABs were introduced. Of those, 430 passed the Assembly, and 7 ABs actually failed passage on the Assembly floor. And in 2020, again, due to the pandemic, 291 ABs made it to the governor's desk. The governor signed 255 ABs and vetoed just 36 of them. Regarding Assembly and Senate resolutions, in the 1920 legislative session, there were 200 Assembly concurrent resolutions that were introduced. 161 of those ACRs passed the Assembly, and 120 ACRs were actually chaptered. There were 36 Assembly joint resolutions that were introduced. 18 AGRs passed the Assembly, and 11 AJRs were chaptered during the 2-year session. And finally, there were 105 House resolutions introduced during the 2-year session. 81 of those passed the Assembly over the 2-year session. Turning to Senate resolutions during the 2019-2020 session, there were 94 Senate concurrent resolutions that were introduced. And of those, 83 SCRs passed the Senate, and 70 SCRs were chaptered. There were also 14 Senate joint resolutions that were introduced over the 2-year session. Of those, 11 SJRs passed the Senate, and 7 SJRs were chaptered. And then lastly, there were 90 Senate resolutions introduced over the 2 years, and 74 of them passed the Senate. In turning to constitutional amendments during the 2019-20 legislative session, in the Assembly, there were 26 Assembly constitutional amendments introduced. Of those 26 ACAs, 5 ACAs passed the Assembly in 2019, but none were chaptered. And 5 ACAs passed in 2020, and 4 of those ACAs were chaptered. Turning to the Senate, there were 10 Senate constitutional amendments that were introduced during the 2019-20 session. 2 SCAs passed the Senate in 2019, but neither of those were chaptered. On the Senate in 2020, no SCAs were passed, and of course, none of them were ultimately chaptered.